You're listening to In-Fisherman Storyline, North America's top voice in multi-species freshwater angling. Here is your host, Thomas Allen.
Okay, we were talking about dry sockets.
All right.
Just a minute ago. This is the In-Fisherman Storyline podcast. This is actually our first on-the-road version. I've actually acquired a mobile kit that we're going to take with us on trips to talk with some of the guides or outfitters or anglers that we're fishing with and kind of get their story. And we're doing this in a hotel room. It's kind of weird. You know, normally a couple of dudes hanging out in a hotel room is going to get frowned upon, but we're going to just do this for the fact that it's windy outside. It's getting cold. Do you feel a temperature drop?
Absolutely.
It changed a lot. And so we're actually in Jackson, Mississippi, not too far from Ross Barnett Reservoir. We're a long ways from our Brainerd offices. And we spent the last week, Dave Penning and myself. Dave is our cameraman over here, a producer. He's the all things Swedish, and Oli and Sven and Lena and...
Yeah, sure, you betcha.
Yeah.
You got that.
And joining us today is Brad Chappell. So we spent the day on the water trolling for crappies, and we did this a couple of years ago. We talked about catching crappies in a various numbers of scenarios. Fished Ross Barnett last time, a couple of years ago, and today we were at a different lake. But we trolled for crappies. And I suppose if you don't like trolling, that might sound a little boring, but with 5 rods. We didn't have the 6th one, obviously, today. It was kind of a circus. So we're going to dig into Brad. Brad does a podcast. He's a guide here in the Jackson area. Are you exclusively crappies?
That's it. 100% crappie.
Well, and that's pretty cool because one of my favorite things about the smaller species of fish is when they get big. Mm-hmm. There's something pretty cool about a big bluegill, big crappie, big perch, Dave. I know you like to cut the sides off of those things where you're from.
They all eat real good.
They do, but one of my favorite fish in the world is I don't know how large, but we'll just say pound plus bluegill. When they get that little wrinkle on their forehead, that's just so cool. But a crappie gets a big hump on his back, doesn't he?
They do. They're kind of like a humpback, and we'll call those super fish, and I'm talking those 3-pounders, humpbacks, because they have a little hump right in front of their head almost.
It seems like the bigger, the heavier they get, that the shoulders, if you will, of a crappie really tends to grow. But listen, if you're not into panfish, you need to go more. Kind of for me, it's almost a primal thing because that's really what got me started was bluegills, crappies, and of course catfish. But I've always been impressed by guys that go big on the panfish. They're a lot of fun. So I want to dig into your past, Brad. I know you're from this area. You're familiar with In-Fisherman. You filmed with Doug a few years ago. Several. Well, would you say 6, 7?
Yeah, I would say 6, 7, maybe even possibly 8 years ago.
Yeah, he's been around. I think we're working on. Good Lord, Dave. How many years has Doug Stange been at In-Fish? 40 years?
He's been a long time.
You've been in the boat with him a lot too, so I've graduated to Dave's
right.
pet. He kind of has to keep me in line, but I want to find out why crappies and take me back. Like think the days of old when we're talking about you being a granddaddy today. So
that's right.
Long time ago.
Well, probably in my 20s, and I'm 48 as of today.
Well, happy birthday.
Well, not actually today. I'm talking about at the moment, I'm 48. But
okay, well.
Back in my early 20s, I decided I wanted to get a fishing boat. And I always loved to eat crappie. Crappie, by far, was the best fish, in my opinion, to eat. Mm-hmm. And I always noticed that crappie fishermen don't tend to give away their catch. Now, if you come across a bass fisherman or a cat fisherman, they'll hook you up. You know, they'll give you all the fillets and catfish, everything else you want, except crappie. And so I purchased a boat, and I was like, I'm gonna really dive into this and figure it out. And I'm not a fisherman that kind of just you think of crappie in the beginning of sitting there watching a bobber and it goes down, and that's a great way to catch them as well. But I'm more of an aggressive fisherman, and I like to cover water and really learn the water, and I kind of got hooked from that very beginning of getting a boat, trying to learn how to catch them because I wanted to eat them. Mm. And then it got to be started fishing a tournament. I fished one tournament, first one come in 4th place, and then I was like, man, I've got this. This is good stuff. And I just really fell in love with the aspect of catching crappie, because every day I go out on the water, it's almost like playing chess. I've got to put a lot of pieces in place at the right time and at the right moment. And it's always a challenge, seems to be with crappie. Weather changes, sunlight, temperature.
They're like a bad high school girlfriend,
Absolutely.
I think is what you said earlier.
Absolutely. I mean,
you just never know what you're going to get.
You've got to really stay on top of them, and they can change extremely quick. And it just from going from sunny to cloudy. So I wanted to eat them, and then I got to where I wanted to fish tournaments and start doing really well in tournaments. And then all of a sudden, I said, well, I'm going to do some guiding on the weekends just to buy more fishing equipment. Mm-hmm. And that way, everything stays good at home. I've got my regular job, but I can fish on the weekends and make more money to buy more fishing equipment. So then in turn, I started guiding every weekend in fishing tournaments. And through the years, I have a lot of people that come back year after year after year, and just gradually turned into a full-time position, mm-hmm. a full-time career, I guess. Also, like you said earlier, I've got my own podcast as well called The Crappie Connection that, we're just totally 100% about crappie. But 4 years ago, my oldest son, he graduated with a sound engineering degree and everything else. And we were talking one day about podcast, and it kind of come up, there's no really crappie fishing podcast out there. And he was like, Dad, I can produce it. Mm-hmm. I know everything there is about that side of it. And he's like, everybody in the crappie fishing world. I was like, well,
makes good sense.
It just kind of clicked. But it's a journey. I've got to meet so many great people from across the country. I think I've taken people from just about everywhere you can imagine, and from all different skill sets. From somebody that's never even caught a fish to the angler that's wanting to get even a little bit more advanced and learn different techniques. So I tell everybody I get to fish with old buddies all the time and new buddies every day. Mm-hmm. And that's how it kind of goes. You meet somebody new, and all of a sudden at the end of the day, if you're fishing with them, you become buddies almost. Mm-hmm. So it's a really fun career, and very blessed to do it.
Well, the people that you meet on the way, I've spent the day in boats with people that I still stay in touch with. In fact, there's a guy here, Shannon Denson, that I'm going to fish with here in a couple of days. He ran boat for me when I was covering the Elite Series on Ross Barnett, and we stayed in touch. Might slip in a turkey hunt up at his place. Absolutely. Do you know all this? I mean, I got priorities, but you're right. There's an element of that. But let's go back to your early tournaments. I want to unpack that a little bit. One of the things I've noticed about all these species, there seems to be in special interest groups, or I don't know, Dave. I would say we're in walleye country in Minnesota, right?
Yeah, walleyes are king.
Walleyes are pretty well king. Bass is starting to catch on.
Yeah, a lot of guys are bass heads, but it seems like walleyes are what everyone goes for in Minnesota, the big target fish.
Or burbot.
Or eel pout, yeah.
Everybody has their favorite fish, and it kind of seems that these groups have formed.
Yeah.
And we were all fishermen once we were young. Anything turned our crank, got us excited. But now that things have kind of, I would say, splintered in a way into the special interest groups, do you feel like the early days of the tournaments that you fished had that established, or was that kind of after you got started?
Here in the South, crappie fishing is really king, I'll be honest with you. You'll even go back to 20 years ago when I really started getting into it. I seen a lot of guys back then even crappie fishing. Now the techniques have gotten really defined and really specialized, from the new age electronics to even old school. I mean, that's one thing that's really good about it in my mind is, if you just want to sit out there with a bobber and a minnow on a hook, you can catch crappie. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to get really advanced with live sonar, you can chase them down and catch them that way. So there's a wide range of it. But, through the years, it's definitely evolved into just very technical ways to catch a fish. And crappie for sure it just keeps getting better and better as far as everything.
Was it cutthroat back then, though? Like, you had guys cutting each other off, and you weren't sharing info?
Absolutely. I mean, it was you'd go to the tournament, and of course everybody wants to know how you did the pre-fishing days, and
Nobody's catching them. They're all
and
sandbaggers.
nobody's catching them. Or what was always the best for me was the guys that really caught a lot of them. And then the tournament day, they would bomb it, and we're like, well, you know why you didn't catch any fish today? And they were like, well, we're like, they're all in your cooler right now. So they would really mess up by really, thin out the hole they were planning on fishing. But, it was always strategies into fishing tournaments, even starting back 20 plus years ago. You had to be, we'd go to the boat ramps and we'd switch baits and colors and everything else, because you would have people come up to your boat and check it out. So it was, and then, you had to play some kind of defense, and you wanted people to see you in a certain area if you're known to be a pretty good fisherman to kind of throw them off even a little bit. So it was a lot of mindset even back, even in the early days of tournament fishing.
Did you have like a junked out John boat you'd practice in later on?
No, I had no. I probably needed to. Anywhere from you see guys in bass truckers to all the way to $100,000 boats fishing crappie tournaments, and it's gotten more advanced for sure. But in the old days, I mean, some of these guys would win it in a 14-foot John boat.
Oh, for sure. And one of the lakes I grew up fishing was a timber lake in western Iowa, and it wasn't real big. It was a no-wake lake, so there's no driving on plane. You wouldn't want to anyways. And the guys that showed up with super shiny, decked-out boats, you're like, yeah. It's the dudes that showed up with boats that had the Martinsville stripe down the side. You're like, that's the guy I'm worried about. It's funny how that works. So the crappie thing is there's a regional attraction, but it's different. And Dave, one of the things that I'd like you to talk about is what you saw as far as crappie fishing growing up, because I don't know that we have crappie tournaments in Minnesota.
No, and it's from up north to down south, crappies are still crappies, but the water clarity is so super clear. It's just a whole
different creature.
Yeah, different deal. But spending enough time in the boat with you over the years, Brad, you've got it so dialed in, and it's a lot different than up north.
Well, but a lot of the techniques that we've seen Brad employ, the trolling especially, I think would work.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But you talk about the spook factor and everything. It just multiplies when you're in that clear water.
So here's a question for you. I don't know if you'll remember this. Maybe we talked about it. There's a longtime friend of mine, a mentor. He's actually passed now. Tommy Skarlis.
Oh yeah.
I knew Tommy. Was a walleye pro. Pretty dang good. He won the PWT championship.
Oh yeah, he's a great PWT angler.
I love him, miss him. He's a longtime friend of mine, but he came down to your neck of the woods and kicked y'all's butts.
Yeah, I fished that tournament. I recall it very well, and he fished pulling planer boards, crankbaits,
little bitty cranks, a Salmo Hornet.
Yeah, I recall seeing him out there, and we're like, "What in the world is this guy doing?" And he come in and, like you said, whipped our tail at it and was like, I've got to figure this out. And I've got planer boards and I can pull them. After that, I learned how. And he really even put another technique that really wasn't known to be a crappie fishing direct technique. But he come down to Grenada Lake, and I don't remember what year that was. I'm going to say about 8 to 9 years ago, probably. But,
I think it was after 2010, but it wasn't much long after that. I spent a lot of time with him working in the walleye circles before I went to bass, but that story is one of my favorites of him. And I can't think of many other anglers that have won a championship in two species.
That's just a crossover from being a really good angler and learning that the fish, the spook factor of the fish, to pull, get your planer boards out of the side of the boat, the fish go around you run into the fish, make contact. That's kind of just putting it together, but unheard of down here.
Oh, it was definitely at the time. Like I said, we seen him out there, and like I said, I fished that particular tournament. It was a big field. I mean, for a crappie tournament, it was probably close to 200 boats in that tournament, and on Grenada Lake, which is the king as far as crappie fishing goes, and there's a lot of guys there from all over the United States, and I don't recall the other angler did really good as far as pulling crankbaits, but I remember Tommy. I would like to actually been able to meet Tommy and know him more, because I've heard such good things about that man.
He was a good man. He was a mentor of mine. I know you spent some time in the boat with him, I think, and shooting shows. And I mean, Tommy could go from casual to professional like that, and we always had something to say. And And like most tournament pros, other tournament pros maybe didn't have so much great to say about him. But what I'll give about Tommy, we're going to do a show about this down the road. I've got some good friends that fish with Tommy. Actually, Kyle Steinfeld is the angler that fished the tournament with Tommy. And he's a good friend of mine. We're going to do an ode to Tommy down the road, so be ready for that. But there was a time, and I don't want to go too deep into this, but he got into a heated situation on the Mississippi River out of Red Wing with another angler. I was there on the water. I watched it happen. But the thing I'll give Tommy is he always stood his ground, right? But that angler, I don't think they were on good terms for quite a while.
Yeah.
There might have been a push of the boat with the foot.
Oh, wow.
There was some stuff that went on, but what Tommy did before he passes, he went through his phone and made sure he was square with the world.
Yeah,
and I think there's a lot to be said about that.
He left a good mark on the crappie fishing world as well. I think he had a really good name, and he represented himself well in the crappie fishing world.
It just took a northern cat to come down with these planer boards to show these guys how to do it. Was that the point in time where you where you first saw trolling applications, or you done it before that?
No. We were pulling crankbaits and everything else at the time, but fishing pressure can play into roles no matter what kind of lake it is, and Grenada Lake's not a clear lake. I mean, it's very muddy lake, and you really wouldn't say that in your mind that the boat spook factor could be in play, but it actually was. These fish, once they get the pressure of fishing on them, they will adjust, and that's what they did at that tournament. I can tell you exactly where he fished at, and I remember it to the T because I pre-fished it. And I didn't catch the weight he did, and for the biggest reason that I think was by using planer boards and getting away from the boat.
Those were they were offshore planer boards, and they were the little ones, I think, weren't they?
No, they had flags.
I think those are. I could be wrong. OR-34.
Ooh, don't give me a lie.
Yeah, they're about 16 inches long, I'd say, and that's a pretty neat way to do it. So they had the tattle flag on it, though, right? You had to have that.
Yep.
Well, we saw today, and we'll dig in today in a little bit, but those bites a lot of times are pretty subtle.
Yeah.
And you need to be like paying attention and pick up the rod and yell at me to set the hook. And I didn't set the hook very well in the first time.
I'm pretty good at that too.
Well, and talk about like Dave. So a crappie under the ice. I remember when I first learned to ice fish, there's little springs on the end of the rods. And that is, I think, if there is a lighter biting fish, I've yet to meet it. But that was really to catch crappies, right?
Oh, a lot of the times, but the big deal underneath the ice, and just like anywhere else, the crappies are crappies. I think there was a big spook factor, and I think I ran into that a long time ago trying to get some underwater footage. And we were set up, and it was through the ice, and a guy came driving across the ice, and he pushed a giant school of crappies right into us. And we were quiet and got on, just on all kinds of great video of these crappies. They just moved right in, and then they hung around. And when that guy drove by, they kind of just slid right back out, kind of almost back to where they came from.
Well, that's the thing, and I definitely want that to be a part of our conversation here, is how forward-facing sonar has taught us the reaction to our presence. And even if you're not running the trolling motor, you mentioned today our aluminum boat, that the water slapping on the boat could be a spook factor. Is there, I mean, I can think of a lot of spooky fish, but when it comes to getting on large crappies in numbers in a boat or even on the ice like that, I don't know if there's a more skeptical critter under the water.
And it's even about the bite. We touched on that for a second. Using live sonar, I would say whenever I've got clients in the boat and they're holding a pole, I will see the bite 80% of the time before they ever feel it. Just by looking at the reaction of the fish on the screen. But, whenever I'm on a guide trip, I don't run my live wells even. As far as that live well cutting on and off, it spooks fish, I've figured out. If you have somebody that steps from the front deck to the back deck really heavy-footed,
that's this guy right here.
That will spook the fish. Just about anything you can imagine, any kind of thing that's going to hit the side of the boat or have any kind of impact onto that surface of the boat will spook crappie, even in muddy water. And this past 3 or 4 months on Ross Barnett, the fish have been really spooky. And we have dirty water. I mean, it's not clear by no means. And there's a lot of days that it's a struggle to get 20 foot from them, and they'll just swim. Not like they've got enough sense to them that knows something's not natural about this big object above them, and they have enough sense to, especially these 2 pound plus fish, they'll just kind of ease away from you. And these tournament guys, they figured out they were using really long poles, and they're chasing them down and putting the baits in front of them. And, that's the only way they can catch them.
Well, you said today, and this was intriguing to me, that when I don't know if you were noticing this with forward facing. No, you said down imaging. So you were seeing fish that seemed to be lower as you went across them, and they would rise after the boat left. So what do you feel like that spook factor has as far as like a time impact? Is it a couple seconds? Is it once you're past the boat length? What do you think?
I think it just kind of depends day to day, and that's the really such part of the putting together those pieces of the puzzle or chess pieces when it comes to crappie is, some days you can just about beat on the boat and it really doesn't affect them. But that particular scenario, I was using my down image just to see how deep the fish were, and I know how deep the jigs are being pulled, and I was right above them in the perfect target range. And honestly, I was like, well, I don't understand why I'm not getting more bites. And turned on the forward-facing sonar and can see the fish out in front of me, and they were about 3 or 4 foot higher in the water column than I was marking them on down image. And the only thing I could come up with is, as far as I got close to them, they would sink down, and once the boat was in a safe distance behind or in front of them, I guess, they would rise up some. So I was fishing underneath them at the beginning, and then by using live sonar, just even in trolling. And a lot of people don't think that trolling can really utilize live sonar, but that particular piece that day really stuck to me, and I run live sonar even now, just trolling to see different things like that. But every day is a challenge. I mean, it's called fishing for a reason.
Well, they definitely keep you guessing, but I think the anglers that are willing to look for those changes, adapt, and then they're going to start catching more fish. And if there is one benefit to forward-facing sonar that I think is irreplaceable, is the opportunity to learn in real time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if it's bass, it's muskies, it's walleyes. We caught walleyes on Gull Lake this year using forward-facing sonar with jigging wraps. So there are applications across the board, and if you're willing to consume what you're seeing, apply it to your presentation, you're going to catch more fish. That's the benefit, I think, more than anything. I believe a lot of the people out there that are kind of anti-forward-facing sonars, they think, oh, you're just seeing a fish, casting to it, and catching it. And that happens, right? There are occasions where you can do that. I think that's pretty fun. And I kind of grew up in the digital gamer-type world, so I get a kick out of that. But really, it comes down to, do you have the sense to apply the technology and then change your presentation to match what you're seeing? And today was a great example. We filmed a cool segment pulling underspin type jig heads.
Yeah.
And we could see the fish on the forward facing sonar on the trolling motor. So we were driving into the wind. You could see schools of fish, and who knows exactly what they all were, but there were certainly a lot of crappies in the mix.
Yeah.
A couple passes, we caught some fish, but those fish were a little higher than the baits that you had set up were running, and you made an adjustment. We upped the speed, caught a couple. On the next pass, you changed the weight of the jig head to a little bit lighter version, to raise it up. So all that information. Now, you can say what you want to say about forward-facing sonar. It is a player in the world right now. It is something that if you choose to adopt and stick by and learn how to use, it's going to make you a better angler. If you have a foundation of fishing and understand how fish work, that's just going to make you more productive. But the thing is, I don't care where you go in the country, what species you pursue, I have yet to see a guarantee.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell everybody that when they're first getting this live sonar, most people, you're going to want to throw it in the lake.
It's not easy to figure it out. It is so
difficult to understand, and it's even, you've got to train your brain to kind of think differently what you're seeing on the units. But most people, the first, it even took me months to get to where I felt really comfortable what I was identifying and what I was seeing on the screen. But it takes a lot of practice. It's not something that you can just go throw in your boat and 3 minutes later you've got a really good grasp of what's going on, because that's not going to be the case. It takes a lot of practice.
It does, and a commitment to maintaining updates, software, and just to messing with the settings. So where Dave and I were fishing the last couple days was in Venice, Louisiana, which pretty dirty water, especially with all the rain that we've had. We had that unit set up. We put it in this lake, and it was totally different. I had to make contrast and sensitivity adjustments, but you remember when mapping came out? You remember when people threw a fit about mapping?
Oh, yeah. It was like a big game changer for a lot of things.
It was. It put people in the right spot. But people don't care about mapping anymore. I would say that's probably the least controversial piece of technology right now that's out there.
Probably so.
But so go back to, I like this technology discussion. Go back to your first electronics, your first graph. What was that?
It was just a 2D, and it was a color screen. I think it was a 480C Lowrance, which was just it had a little bit of color to it.
Did it beep every time you went over a fish?
No, I couldn't stand that. I always had to take that setting off. But, I use maps then a lot. That's one thing about, crappie fishing too, that if you learn their patterns, their seasonal movements, mapping can save you a lot of wasted time as well, just like live sonar or anything else. But if you really pay attention to maps and duplicate areas that you're having success at different areas, even on different lakes, you can just pick up a map. And I've won a tournament before by not even pre-fishing, just saying this is what makes sense, and going there just based off mapping. So mapping's a very big key as well. And still always will be for me.
So that was just a 2D unit. How big was the screen?
Probably 6-inch. I think I might even still have it in my shop. I'm not.
Could you imagine having to look at that thing now? We just talked about this today. The vision factors hit me in the last couple months, and I know you guys have been dealing with it for a while. Although you have pretty good eyes, Dave. I don't think you wear glasses, do you?
No, I don't wear glasses.
It's that Swedish vision. They can see through walls.
I think so.
Well, and technology's impacted a lot of fishing, but talk a little bit about what you would say to a youthful angler, someone coming into the sport, and bass fishing, crappie fishing, catfishing. What is the most important aspect of talent development they need to have?
Paying attention to details. Details in fishing are probably the biggest factor between catching 15 or catching your limit of 30. Paying attention to smallest details. And if you ever talk to really good anglers, they pay attention to details. And it might be, very minute details as far as how they're tying their jigs on line or what pound test they're using. But everything has a piece that goes into a puzzle of fishing. But if you learn to pay attention to details, your angler skills will improve tremendously.
How valuable is it to visit different waters and pick those apart and try tactics that work at home versus what might make sense locally?
Well, that's one of the things that even tournaments, and I got to where I thought I was a pretty good angler and started fishing tournaments, and you'd go to different lakes. And one thing that I noticed is, at least for crappie, every lake has a personality almost. They have a preference of colors and bait profiles and different things. But, going back to dissecting details, that's when it comes to fishing, your elimination. Everything you're trying to do is eliminating something from a speed that's not working. And you're just trying to narrow down everything that you're doing to finer details. And the faster that you're able to do that in any body of water, I honestly feel like you can just about go anywhere in the country if you learn to pay attention to the details of those lakes. Current, there's so many factors that people really don't think about until somebody else says it and says, you know what, there was a lot of current I noticed today in the lake. Those fish wasn't there when we didn't have a current, and all of a sudden the currents pushed them to this area. So there's a lot of factors that even under the water that you can't see by map or even by electronics, that if you learn to pick up on, and they're like any other creature. If it makes sense here, it's going to make sense at your home lake.
One of the things that I learned when we moved to Alabama, and we spent, I think, 2015 through 2000, early 2000, like the middle of the summer. I went down there thinking I could catch a bass.
Yeah.
I lived in Minnesota where they were all dumb. Half of them have never seen a lure in their life, and they love to bite. And I think it was a great proving ground for me. It was an opportunity to learn techniques and make it work and, dial in my game. But I got to Alabama, and everybody's got a bass boat.
Yeah.
And everybody goes to Guntersville. There's a tournament 365 days a year on that lake, so it seems.
Wow.
Well, I got schooled. I mean, It was rough, but the details were critical. It was, okay, well, so you see where there's a lot of boats staged around the river channel, okay, June, right? That's the ledge bite, and then they would move into the grass later in the summer, and of course it's 375 billion degrees. I don't know how you guys deal with June through August here, or October, I suppose.
Well, yeah.
It gets hot, but Dave and I have a sweat factor. I think we get to about 70 and we're uncomfortable.
Oh, no.
But those details, you're right, and the current is one thing that from lake to lake, even small lakes that we have in Minnesota have wind-driven current, and that can move bait that a crappie will key on and then move the crappies. On the lakes I fished in Alabama, most of the lakes in the South are impoundments, right? And you think you're on them, right? You're practicing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for a Saturday, Sunday derby, and they shut the water off Saturday, Sunday, and you're like, what? I totally lost. I don't know what's going on. It took a while to figure that out, and even then, I didn't like fishing on the weekends.
Yeah.
You got a lot of extra boats, and you got no water moving unless the water was high, and it was hard. So I think in lakes like Lake of the Woods, and some bigger lakes up north especially, there are currents and even almost tides, if you will, where that water level and the current direction is dictated on the conditions. And, we've learned this together, Dave, or I learned it especially at Lake of the Woods last year, trolling for muskies, that the current in some portions of the narrow big narrows especially, it can change directions.
Yeah.
And those fish will reposition because of that. So take today for an example. We had sustained 10 to 15 mile an hour winds plus, and we were running the boat into the current. Do you feel like those crappie, do they face a direction? Are they willing to turn? One of the things I've heard is you want to drag a bait downstream to catch a smallmouth.
Right. Not
always true, but that's a general rule. Do you feel like that crappies have that tendency?
Not as far as the wind and waves necessarily. I haven't never seen them position themselves, facing into the wave or with the wave to say. I've seen it. The other factor would be the boat noise that those waves would cause. But, current, like on Ross Barnett, my home lake, and it is a fisherman's lake. It will teach you and it will humble you as well in the same token. But, current 2 years ago, we had a lot of spring rains, and I was catching fish. We had like 13 inches of rain coming in like 3 days.
Oh.
And that puts a lot of current in that lake. But where I've been catching them at, all of a sudden they disappeared. And I was like, I don't understand what's going on here. The fish are supposed to be out here where they've been for the last month. And then all of a sudden a light bulb went up. It's the current. It's the current that's coming through the center of the lake that's going through the lake. All of a sudden those fish that were out in the center pushed all to the sides to get the current breaks. But, say the past 2 months, I like current because it can really narrow down where they'll be at. Because they're kind of like us. If we're standing out in a field and the wind's blowing 40 and it's 20 degrees, we're going to look, even if you got to stand behind a tree to get by and actually have some of that relief from the wind. These fish do the same thing, but in essence with current. So if there's a lot of current and they've got one little spot they can stick behind and get out of that big movement, they're going to do it. Mm-hmm. So it's just really cool to me.
Well, I want to expand on that, and before that, Dave, the question I have for you, I want you to talk about Barotrauma in the north. I feel like that's a thing that we deal with, especially when things are ice covered. We get into this time of year. We don't have a lot of ice this year. That's a side story. But, anglers that are catching and releasing crappies this time of year are almost assuredly killing a number of them. And there is a theory behind it. But what do you see happen? Is there a time in the summer that affects them too?
Well, anytime you're pulling them up from deep water, they're pretty fragile. Mm-hmm. But Aaron Weeb did I watched some stuff he did, and it was a real eye-opener, even pulling them up from 38 feet of water. Mm-hmm. He would, through the ice, he handle them gently, you don't overhandle them, get them unhooked quick, you take a picture, put them in the hole, close their mouth, turn them upside down, let them go. And he watched them on a live scope, and they would slowly swim to the side and slowly reach depth, and they were fine. You could see it on a live scope, but you really have to handle them the right way.
Well, and another thing to check out is it's Uncut Angling, I believe, is his channel. Have you seen him before?
Yeah.
He does an awesome job.
Yep.
He's kind of my hero at YouTube, if you want to get down to it. But he did a whole video. He spent like 96 hours in a fish house on some lake in the Lake of the Woods ballpark. It might have been Lake of the Woods. And he caught these crappies and saved, I don't know, want to say 7, 8 or so, and put fin clip weights on them, kept them upright, and actually brought them back to health. One of them died, which he ate, and that was a big part of his survival, factor to this video. Right. I highly recommend you go watch it. It's interesting. So I think what that did is it poked a little bit of holes in the barotrauma theory and the delayed mortality. However, what Dave said, I've heard, you talked about it with me, I've heard other people talk about this too, it's the handling and the quick return, and that they might have some ability to survive. But there is the reality too, where I've seen people this time of year in the north, it's late ice, there's a lot of ice, oxygen levels are starting to sink, it's getting, you need to have a lot of the snow melt and the ice to clear up to kind of create more oxygen for those fish. And anybody throwing the crappies back down onto the ice, they just die and they end up under the ice. So I know that happens, but we don't really know exactly the long-term effects or how it does it. But Aaron Weeb has opened up our eyes to that to an extent. What happens here in the south?
Well, I've caught them this year as deep as about 26 foot, and then overall our waterways are a lot shallower than some of you guys up north. But you talk about fin clips, and whenever we would put them in live wells for tournaments, we would put fin clips on them to kind of weigh them down a little bit, and you make them sit upright, and after a period of time they would be fine. And actually I have a buddy of mine, his name's Dustin McDaniel, that does some of the podcast stuff with me. He would and he fishes Grand Lake in Oklahoma. He guides over there, but he blows back in their mouth.
You said something about that.
Yeah, Gord Pizer was doing that up on the ice, and
it worked.
It worked, but I don't know. I thought it was Canadian foreplay, but I don't know.
Yeah, I would have never believed it. But they're used to catching fish anywhere from 35 to 40 up there, and and on a non-keeper, he wanted to get them back in the water and survive. I don't know what made him think about doing it, but he actually has a video of him blowing a couple of them's mouth and watch them go right back down after being caught real deep.
Well, that kind of leads me into my next topic of thought here. The conservation side of fishing is super important. I think crappies are I would say, among the most susceptible to overharvest.
Yeah.
And some of the bigger lakes, you're right, you mentioned Ross Barnett today. It's almost impossible to overharvest. I mean, people find a way, right? It's not impossible, but for the most part, it's too big of a lake, too many places for those fish to hide, so that there would be a sustainable population. But with the live sonar technology, with the growing interest in fishing, talk a little bit about your belief in conservation. And we put all our fish back today. We didn't keep the one, but how important is that to sustainable crappie populations?
Well, and you guys probably haven't heard of them, but it's an organization called Crappie Forever that I'm deeply involved with, and we actually tagged some of the bigger fish for, I don't know how many I've tagged for Ross Barnett and some other lakes as well, but and we're trying to get some research on these big fish, and I'm talking 2 pound to 3. They've got some tagged 3.5 even, but they're tagging them. And you know, kind of my thought when it comes to crappie harvest is, you know, I want everybody to enjoy them because that's what they're here for. And I want people to utilize them, but, you know, keep what you need and throw back the rest. And especially in the springtime, I try to get my clients to, especially these big 2.25 plus pound fish, we'll tag them and we'll release them. And it's been really neat to have people, because they can identify tag number 185 they caught, and they can go on a website and keep track of that fish and see if it's ever caught again. And
talk about that process, the tagging of fish. Is that when you're fishing you can do it yourself, or do you need to be with a DNR official?
Well, we don't have to be with a DNR here. They've got it all set up, but we have tagging guns in our boat, and each one of them's, you know, a particular number. And what we'll do is we'll weigh them, get the length, and we'll do a video release typically, not all the time with tagging, but and get a general location of wherever we caught that fish at. That way, let's say next year somebody catches that fish, they'll do a video of them catching it and, you know, show a picture of tag number 185 and then releasing it, and then they just turn it back and they get a reward for releasing that fish again. And we're just trying to pass on the really good genetics of that fish, and especially these big trophy fish. We want them from other anglers to even catch and take a picture of them. And it just, you know, it's good for the fishery, for these big brood females in my mind, to pass on their genetics. And it's almost like they deserve to keep on going almost. Yeah. They put up with a lot.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of conservation minded anglers out there today more than ever. I mean, there was a time, I hate to say this, but Dave's probably of that generation, where they kept whatever they could and ate it.
Never met a fish I didn't eat.
and you know what? I think that an interesting part of our fishing history is Bassmaster and Ray Scott really implemented the catch and release format to really maintain populations for tournament fishing, and bass especially, but that caught on across all sorts of species. And the yin to the yang, I think, would have been In-Fisherman, and I'm forgetting it now. It's a big part of our organization, but it's the selective harvest.
Yeah, selective harvest is a way to sustain populations of fish that eat fish, but enjoy the fish, but leave some too.
Yeah, and Doug Stange, our editor-in-chief, is a staunch proponent of you're going to laugh at this, and maybe you won't, but his favorite fish to eat is about anywhere from a 12 to 15 inch largemouth. Oh yeah. and when I ask him this one day, he's going to be like, "Yeah, well, people are going to get mad, but they are a fine eating fish. Yeah. Under certain times of the year, and I think that any of us that have fished or hunted understand and respect the value of packing the freezer up. But there's a point where you don't need 300 crappies in your freezer. I mean, I will eat fish whenever available. I got to send my son out because I don't fillet fish. I got to think with that. It's a long story. He knows. I've taught my son how to fillet fish, so I don't have to. But anyway, the point is, keep what you need.
That's right.
I feel like you don't need to plan to have a fish fry every single Friday like that. Nobody does that. Yeah. But there is a mentality that we need to get into, anglers, hunters alike, that maybe you don't need 17 deer tags. Maybe you don't need a chest freezer full of walleye and crappie fillets. Take what you need, because it is a part of who we are as humans, as hunters and anglers, is to enjoy the consumption part of it.
Well, I think it kind of goes back with crappie. In years past, and I'm talking 20 plus years ago, crappie fishing was only a springtime event almost. You would see the dogwoods bloom in the south area, and then you knew that the crappie are on the bank. You could go catch them shallow.
And the turkeys are gobbling.
That's correct. But everybody fished only during the springtime, and the rest of the year they did other things. So that spring they filled up their freezer. Well, nowadays, with all the different advancements of electronics and even techniques, we can catch them year round now. So it's kind of like me. I maybe right now have 0 fillets in my freezer. And you think, well, you fish 200 days a year. That's kind of crazy. But I feel like if we have, a need to catch some fish and we want to eat them, I can go catch them, and no matter what month it is. And that's just from the advancement of technology and techniques.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a pretty interesting calendar, if you will, of the fish year, if you will, and all fish have kind of a calendar that they live by. What would let's start in March of the year for you. Walk me through the year and how those patterns change. And this is probably some secret sauce. So, keep what you want. But what's important here is if somebody is going to take up crappie fishing to a level that you have, how do you follow them 365?
Well, springtime is probably, and it's probably flipped some folks' mind even, springtime is my least favorite time to crappie fish. And for the really reason that these fish are on the move. One day, you got 3 or 4 days of really nice weather and stable weather. They're all on the shoreline and biting like crazy, and a snow cold front comes in and pushes them back deep. But we'll start with the pre-spawn, and it's kind of like where we're at today, and these fish are just kind of staged up on the outer edges of where they're wanting to spawn at. And another week to 2 weeks, depending on lakes, they'll move into their actual spawning time frame. And here in the South, that can actually run anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months. It can really...
What's the water temp that really kicks that off?
62 is what really, I know that there's going to be some fish shallow. I have in my mind there's going to be some fish shallow. And I'm going to check it, depending on some other things. But 62, I feel like these fish will be spawning somewhere in the lake. Then... you'll get through with the spawn, let's say mid-May, and those fish are going to come back just where I call them pre-spawn. They're going to just slowly move back out from their spawning habitat to where they were for pre-spawn, so that's the post-spawn period. And then it usually lasts not as long as a pre-spawn, but I'm going to say 10 to 21 days, I'm going to guesstimate, that a post-spawn pattern will be evident. And then after that, you go to summertime, which is probably my favorite. These fish are going to go to some kind of deep kind of ledge that has some kind of structure, and they're going to be there every day. And you can they're pretty reliable. They're going to go to an area that they can have shade, a good food source, and they'll be there every day. They're not going to move. They'll be there from beginning of June all the way through the end of September to mid-October. And
have you put the trolling gear away at this point, or are you still maybe trolling?
It depends. I mean, I can catch them pulling crankbaits at the time, or even in steel jigs. And now with live sonar, we'll actually cast to them, which I never did before live sonar. Actually, we'll cast to brush piles, which is extremely fun to do. Standing timber, I mean, you can catch them just about any way you can imagine in the summertime. And about mid-October, the water will start cooling off, and they'll come up off structure and they'll start to suspend. And a lot of them will go not as shallow as they will in the springtime, but they're going to go into a shallower area of the lake. And a lot of time that's based on their forage and their shad, where the gizzard shad's at, and threadgill or what have you. But they're going to gravitate to the shallower areas of the lake when it comes into the fall. And almost like the summertime, after that, and when you get into the winter, those fish go to their winter grounds, and that's just about exactly like the summer grounds. So I kind of think of summertime and wintertime in the same areas of the lake, and spring and fall's about the same areas of the lake as well. But wintertime, they're going to get out into the deeper areas. Typically, they're not going to hold on to the structure as heavily as they will in the summertime, but they're going to be in the same vicinity as they were in the summertime for you.
Do you feel like they get into a calorie conservation mode in the summer here?
Well, I think they feed a lot more at night than we give them credit.
Okay. So that water gets super warm here. I mean, in the 90s.
Super hot. And, they'll get in areas and they'll cluster together and get in really large schools. And I'm talking, anywhere from 100 crappie to, 300 or 400 on one particular piece of brush pile or what have you.
Oh, sounds like fun.
Oh, it's crazy. But, I think I don't start my trips even off early in the mornings. And a lot of times, if it's a new client, they're thinking, all right, July, it's going to be 95 today. We need to be out there at the crack of dawn. And I'm like, no, we'll be out there about 8. And they're like, oh, this is crazy. And I'm like,
right where they're at, though.
I know where they're going. Mm-hmm. And it's at nighttime and early in the morning, they're out feeding and they're roaming around. And as that sun comes up, it's kind of like a magnet. It pulls them to some kind of structure for them to hold on. So is
it the shade you think they're looking for?
A lot. And it's kind of like you said, conserving calories almost. They can get in a piece of structure with a school of them and just kind of sit there and I guess withstand the heat of the day and just kind of really gang up and chill out, for lack of a better word.
Well, I mean, we're no different. One of the things that I learned in the South is that I had to carry one of these around everywhere I went, just to survive the summer days. If I was going to go to an afternoon church event, I was taking a towel because I have a leaking problem. Well, I would think, and from what I've seen with fish in the North versus the South, is that they're accustomed to that, right? They don't know the difference. Yeah. They're not gonna get in their crappie bus and drive down to watch an Alabama game roll tide.
Right.
Can I say that here?
You can.
You don't care. Anyway,
no.
So they don't have to reacclimate to different climates, but I would think that the extreme conditions, in our case, it's ice, and especially those years where we've had late ice. I mean, that plays hell on not just crappies, but every critter out there. There are lakes that we lose occasionally because of winter kill, but here, I would imagine the heat of the summer is probably and I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the most stressful time to be a crappie? Or is it the winter? Or maybe anywhere?
Probably the summer.
Mm-hmm.
It's so
especially if they get caught, right?
Well, yeah. If they get caught, they're pretty much, I can't say that. We release a lot that survive. Mm-hmm. But, it's kind of like us. You get hot, you kind of get miserable, and those fish get kind of lazy, and there's such an abundance of forage for them to eat. They really don't have to work for food, especially during the wintertime. They can just chill out, and the shad's going to come to them almost. Mm-hmm. But summertime's probably the most stressful just because of the high water temp, I would imagine. But no one's ever told me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dave, so you spent a lot of time filming with Doug, and I know he loves to catch spawning crappies. And so what is our timeline in Minnesota for most crappie spawns?
It varies with the weather, but it's usually June.
Yep. And that's when they're in like the pencil reeds.
Yeah, they're in the pencil reeds.
Hard bottom. And so your primary spawn is going to be middle to late March?
Oh, I'm going to probably flip you out even with this. We've got, during the spawn, it's typically going to start first part of March to mid-March. And I have seen them spawn down here on Ross Barnett in the beginning of June still for 3 months.
Do you think that's generational? Do you think there's a chance that fish spawn a couple times during that time frame?
No, I don't think. I think they just, Mother Nature's pretty good at what she does with these crappie. She's spreading out that spawn for, the highest survival rate possible. I do see a different pattern that I've noticed over the last couple of years when it comes to even spawning fish and how they change cover depending on the time of the spawn. And I call them breeder stumps. And as that spawn progresses and it gets towards the end of it, there's very key pieces of structure that they will fine-tune on and only spawn on. Early spawn and the heat of the spawn itself, you can catch them spawning on a little bit of every kind of cover out there. It could be a pipe in the lake and they're going to spawn on it. But as the end of the spawn comes, they're going to really key in to what I would consider big breeder stumps. And like I said, 1st of June, I'm still catching some fish, 6 foot of water, and dark as night, males, and just aggressive and in 6 foot of water. Now everything else, as far as that depth range, is null and void at that time, but they really, at the end of the spawn, they key into particular breeder areas more, and I think they concentrate more than the beginning of the spawn. Like I said, I feel like they're everywhere, and as it gets progressively towards the end of it, there's going to be really key areas that they spawn on.
I'm gonna make a big leap here with a comparison, and this is just something I experienced, but with whitetails. In the South, again, I moved south thinking I knew what I was doing, and it was a lot more complicated than I thought. I was humbled quickly. I grew up in Iowa, hunted Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, some absolute epic whitetail country.
Yeah.
But you could almost plan pretty close to the day every year the whitetail rut, and it would be, I would say, if you pick 4 days, and Dave, you spent a lot of time in the woods in the rut during Minnesota, or during the rut in Minnesota, I would say there's a 5-day period where the peak occurs. Would you agree?
Yeah, things happen fast in the north. It's like, and then same way with spawning fish. It's like they do it, and they do it now.
Yeah.
And then where it's more spread out in the south, it's more like a jackrabbit on a date up north. So
that's a great comparison. And I think that the thing that taught me about the way the breeding cycle occurs, or the feeding cycle occurs in the South, is it doesn't get cold enough here where these deer are in any danger of dying.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas in Minnesota, they have to get up at 4 p.m. to get to the food source that maybe it's a quarter mile, maybe it's 2 miles. They're going to the most abundant food available, and they breed at a time so that their fawn survival rate is maximized by the calendar. Right?
Yeah.
So I see that occur in the north with the fish. Like, their spawn is going to be in a pretty condensed time frame, and it can vary. And I think that certain years, weather, this year especially, is going to be interesting to see how the spawn happens, because it's been so warm. We've got open water in Brainerd, Minnesota right now. Doug told me it's been 30 years since that happened. So it's going to be an interesting year, but the calendar might still reign supreme there, because they know that somehow it's baked into their psyche that for their offspring to survive, they have to be large enough at a certain point before winter hits to make it through the winter. And I think that deer, turkeys, everything that in the north, they largely depend on playing by the calendar. So what you're saying makes sense to me, because here in the South, they can do it. They can do it with quote marks, for a longer period of time, and the survival rate is going to be more successful where we have a short window.
It kind of, ensures their spawn to be even more successful when they can spread it out, in my mind, because if something happens and all of a sudden they have a total loss on the first 3 weeks of the spawn, to say, well, they've got the other 9 weeks to pick it up and make sure that population carries over. But it's really neat being able to see things on the water for periods of time, and you hear the saying, "Time on the water is king," and it will teach you more than anything else in my mind. Will is just good old time on the water.
Well, and nobody's going to complain about more of that, for sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about the current state of fishing. One of the things that I think is at the top of everybody's mind is technology, and I have my opinions. I'm not afraid to share them, and we'll get into that. I think it's very important that, to an extent, if you're going to grow as an angler, you have to embrace technology.
Yeah.
And there's a point, I do think, and we're probably looking at it, where we might have reached or are very close to the peak of technological advancement. And I think just this week, it is March 9th. 2024, and the state of Wisconsin has introduced yet another bill to move forward the banning or restricting of live sonar. And I'm of the belief that the sonar is not necessarily a problem. Now, it could contribute to a problem, but let's talk a little bit more about how you think, I guess, in the South, in the tournament scene, and then all the way up north where Dave and I live, how is that going to impact anglers, and how is it going to impact fish?
Well, kind of my thought is, I've seen underwater now, and I don't want to go back not being able to see. And then also, I think that we're going to, as anglers, we're going to have to let it known more to the Department of Wildlife, no matter what state you're in, what you're seeing on the water. And I work really closely with, and sometimes they're not even, they don't want to hear from me as much as they do, because I let them know what I see very often. And I think we've got to be a really sounding board for whatever species that we're targeting on these lakes to help them keep track of them even closer. It goes back to selective harvest and what you can actually personally do to affect it. Like you said earlier, there's no reason to have 300 crappie in your freezer. Is there a reason to have 25 or 30? Yeah.
Yeah.
But not really 300. Also, I think these lakes are going to have to be more managed lake by lake instead of a broad region more. We mentioned today Ross Barnett, which is a 35,000 acre lake, and we fished Eagle Lake today. Is about a 4,500 acre lake, and there's differences in what that lake can carry and what it can be harvested every year. And it can be fished.
We showed up today with 40 boats in the parking lot anyways.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And really not ideal conditions to go fishing.
Do you, how many, if you were to just give a guess on a percentage, how many of those boats were out for their limit?
Oh, they were trying to catch them, every one of them. And I would say out of those boats, at least on that lake today, I would say every one of them was crappie fishing.
Okay, let's do a little math here. I'm not good at this, so I'm going to pull up my calculator. Let's pretend there were 40 boats on that lake. The limit per person in this state is
30 a person.
Okay, so we'll just say there's two anglers per boat at the minimum, right? So 30 times 40 today, that's 1,200 crappies potentially in one day that could come out of that lake.
Yeah.
That's too many. I think maybe not today it's too many, but over 6 weeks of that, like I feel like if the sonar has given them that advantage to find and catch that number of fish more often, that will certainly have an impact on a 4,500 acre lake.
Oh yeah, it will. And I think even we got during the after our trip today, we had a biologist there, and he was doing surveys. And
did he ask about sonar?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
He asked were we using live sonar or not. I think a lot of these agencies are starting to really recognize that they're going to have to even step up their game by staying on top of things with it. And I'm really pleased with what they've done here in Mississippi. And I have heard rumors that they're considering knocking down our daily limits from 30 to 15 a person. I do not know that to be factual. I am crossing my fingers that is the case. I'd rather go out there and keep 15 big fish than keep 30 smaller fish. So I hope it's knocked down personally.
Dave, let's talk a little bit about what Minnesota is doing. They sometimes it's an inconvenience, but we at a lot of the landings we stop and talk with some folks that are checking boats. For the most part, I think it's invasive species. But have you been asked about technology or asked about what you're keeping?
No, what you're keeping, yeah, but not technology yet.
Would that surprise you if that happened this summer?
Probably not, but I think it's going to come.
I kind of feel like what's happening, granted, the bass scene is really what's pushed a lot of this concern and discussion. I think it's bringing awareness to what's going on. And maybe some of the lakes I've seen, Dave, you could probably correct me here. I feel like a lot of there is a walleye limit by state regulation, right?
Right. And then like you said, you pointed out, it's going to be more lake by lake management.
There's some of that going on, though.
Oh yeah, lots of it.
And some lakes, it may not. You might be able to keep a number of them, but the length restrictions or slots is what is implemented.
The slot limits. And
what's a slot look like? What's a regular slot that you'd see?
1/17, and limits will vary by lake to lake.
So you could keep, let's say, 6 in the state of Minnesota right now? So you could keep 5 under 17 and 1 over.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Lake D'Arbonne in Louisiana, they have a slot limit on crappie on that lake. I believe they can keep 5 over 12, and then they can keep the other 25 has to be under it. So they only can keep, and I could be wrong, but I know they have a slot limit. They just started on Darbone, and the reports I'm hearing back from the slot limit is it's working. So
to what level? Now, we of course, we live in a fun political climate right now, but, I think there probably has to be some level of state regulation implemented to curb overharvest or get ahead of what could potentially happen. But really, I feel like it comes down to personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
And it's not necessarily wrong. It is not illegal necessarily. What did you say? You can have 7 days worth of a limit. Mm-hmm. We're going to do some more math. So you say if it's 30 a person right now for 7 days.
7 days.
So that's 210 crappies in your possession legally at any time in this state.
Yes. That's too much.
That's too much.
Yeah.
So people need to throw some fish back.
Yeah. They're going to have to. And we need to express as anglers what we want. And the thing is, I know it's like anything else in life. These guys that are in the position to make the calls are wanting to make the anglers happy, and they're wanting to keep the resource healthy. And the more that we're sounding boards about that, the more they're going to respond to it. Lake Washington, and I guided at that lake for years, and at one time it was ranked number 3 in the nation as far as large crappie, and I've caught some giants in it over the years. But in, I want to say 2019 and 2020, I felt like we had really bad spawns for whatever factor that might have been, and the lake's been hurt. I mean, I haven't got it on it in 3 years now, and I have a cabin sitting there perfect for guiding. Mm-hmm. But so I've had to adjust it away from it. But the thing that we're trying to do, and we reached out as anglers in the area and really got our biologists involved, and they've done a lot of sampling and net surveys and traps and everything else, and then they realized that it was hurt as well. But I think what kicked them into high gear was the public, the fishermen saying, hey, something's going on this lake, y'all need to get up here and really dive into it. And they did. And first time I ever knew that the Department of Wildlife in Mississippi has ever stocked crappie in a lake. They stocked them this past fall, which is they usually have hatcheries for state small lakes and ponds and such, but this was the first time they ever stocked a large impoundment, and it's about 4,000 acres, so it's not that large, but first time in the history that they actually come in and stocked a lake. And I don't think it was because of live sonar or
could have been like a forage-based crash or something like that.
Could have been. Yeah. I think it was a Mother Nature crash, and some of these lakes are just going to have highs and lows even.
I think they all ebb and flow.
Yeah. They're going to have great years, and then they're going to have off years, and I think it's just in a natural cycle that it had. But I think nowadays we can kind of help it out and protect it even further.
Well, it's definitely a luxury to have. I mean, I would say Mississippi is probably if it's not the number one state in the country for crappies, it's a close second. Yeah. And this is where you can come to get a heavy limit or get a trophy class fish, but to be able to like you said, kind of give a little kick in the pants to a struggling population is pretty impressive. Dave, do you know what did we hear about Mille Lacs this year? What do you know? What was?
I don't know.
Well, there's some stuff that's been going on. So for several years, the Minnesota DNR has highly restricted the harvest of walleyes in that lake. And I can't say I'm not going to give what I think I heard, because we are we're publishing this, so I don't want to be held accountable to a number. But I've heard that harvest is going to be, if not shut off, extremely restricted, which I don't know how you get more restricted than one fish per day. But there's other stuff going on at that lake. But what had occurred number of years back, I think, was a perch population crash. Or was it the shiners? Or was it both, maybe?
I think it was both.
And that really seemed to, for a year or two, hurt the walleye population. Or maybe, and I'm not saying I know this because I'm not a very effective walleye fisherman on my own. I can catch them once in a while with a plastic worm when I'm bass fishing. But what I have noticed is you can go to that lake, fish for smallmouth, and half the fish you catch that day are walleyes, and they're good ones, and through the ice as well.
Yeah, they are. There's a lot of walleyes. What I would like to see is let the anglers if they're going to restrict it, let them catch one fish every angler, so at least people that are fishing can have something to eat, and call it like that.
Yeah, it seems a little overkill with what's going on there, but on the flip side, you know, it might need, that's the kind of the kick in the pants that 3 years from now or next year, whenever they decide to reopen those keep limits, everybody's like, oh my gosh, it's great, it's awesome. Yeah. You know, they're like, it really must have worked out. But, you know, in Minnesota, I'm not exactly sure how long it takes to grow a 16-inch walleye. I'd say that's probably 4, 5, 6 years. You're not a biologist, but what would you say?
Yeah, I guess I can't say for sure.
But you know that a crappie here grows substantially over a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, like Eagle Lake, where we're at today when we fished, you know, to be a keeper on that lake, they needed to be over 11 inches, and that fish is pretty much a 2.5, 3-year-old fish, according to what I've heard from biologists. And like I said, I'm no biologist either. I'm just a fishing guide. But that's about a 3-year-old fish, and they want them to have at least one really good spawn before they are subject to being harvested. And
well, that's a big difference with what we deal with. I mean, we know a 4, 5, 6 pound largemouth or smallmouth bass, those are old fish. Yeah. It takes a long time to regrow those.
Oh yeah.
Where I think your growing cycle here is probably year round. There's probably not a lot of times where they're
probably not
starving. But I think that's something that anglers north to south need to realize is what you're experiencing on your own personal body of water may not represent the entire country or the entire state for that matter, because things vary within the state. And the crappie population at Lake of the Woods is, from what I understand, it's very healthy and it's very attractive. Like those fish that Aaron Weeb and Jay Siemens have caught on video, and if you haven't seen those, go check it out. They're impressive fish. They're huge and they're yellow and
I've seen.
They're pretty awesome. Yeah. But I don't think you just go up there and catch those at will. So I know that they're there, but here you can go and catch for you, what would you say is a big fish on a daily basis? What's your big average?
2 1/4.
That's a big crappie.
Yeah.
Anywhere you go in the country, that's an impressive crappie.
Yeah, 2 1/4. I mean, it's a lot of people that this week I had a gentleman from North Carolina, and we called his personal best, and he was probably 65 years old, and it was a 256. But, you know, even going back to the whole harvest thing, there's going to be some lakes that benefit from harvest.
For sure.
Some of these lakes that have been stunted and overpopulated with fish, and I think that comes back to these lakes are going to have to be managed more lake by lake than more regional.
I think that's what we're looking at, and I'm hopeful that the Wisconsin situation doesn't make an outright ban on the technology. I think we're going to see some of that. In fact, I would almost stake my career on the fact that we're going to see bills introduced at the state level that hopefully would ban it. And I'm not saying hopefully on my behalf, but their effort is to ban it completely. And back into that discussion a little bit. So tell me a little bit about what you've learned about crappie behavior because of forward-facing sonar.
Oh, man.
And this could be a deep dive, but hey, that's what we want.
You know, I would say the first thing is they're very spooky. I didn't realize that how spooky they were. And then another thing I kind of realized that they're all over the place. And one time when we were thinking about trolling or what have you, it would be to the fact that we wanted to make sure everything was exactly the same. And with live sonar, now we've realized that there might be some fish at 2 foot in the water, and then there's some in 20 foot of water, and they're scattered about in the water column. And but there's a lot of fish in these lakes, and there's a lot of fish that we're not targeting in the lakes as well in there that I never knew was that many of them out there. Another thing is, let me see, like crappie, you have always heard that they won't hit a bait down, and I've seen them hit baits down. But just to me was how spooky they really were. And I never thought of them as being a fish that traveled all that much, and we would really concentrate on a ledge and think, all right, they're just sitting over there on this ledge, or they're just waiting for some prey to come by them. But in periods of the time of the year like right now, these fish are not sitting still. They are actively swimming. back and forth, and up to a mile an hour at all times. So they're moving a lot more than I ever gave them credit for, because I always thought, well, they're a lazy fish. They're just going to kind of sit and wait on prey to come by them. But with live sonar, I've actually seen the difference that they're actively moving nonstop.
It's impressive to me what you're able to learn on just the behavior level itself, and species to species. It's amazing the change. I can think of a particular lake in Minnesota where we could drill a hole right now and catch 300 bluegills. Then they're all going to be about 6-7 inches long at the most. But you might every hour have this school of crappie swim through, and I think there's a late in the year, late in the winter season, late in the ice fishing season, there's a lot of the crappie sticks will talk about the basin. And a lot of these lakes, the natural lakes in Minnesota, have just different bays and main sections of the lake. But really, those crappies are going to live basically in the little portion of the lake that you find them in. But they just kind of like make a loop. Yeah, and they're a little bit more pelagic, I would say, than a bluegill, and most especially a bass. Yeah.
And, I did a podcast years ago with a particular biologist, and probably 10, 15 years ago, they did a radio track study on some crappie. And I asked him, I was like, well, what's the largest distance you've seen a crappie move in 24 hours? It's going to blow your mind. Take a guess.
Yes.
How far are you thinking?
Is it miles?
Yeah.
In a 24-hour period?
24-hour period.
All right, I got
Don't
a number.
go crazy now.
I got a number. What do you think? You go first.
2.25.
I was going to say 3.
5 miles.
Whoa!
He had a radio track crappie that moved 5 miles and 20, and that was my response. I was like, "Wow, you're kidding me!" And he's
how much of that is it? Do you think it's linear or is it repeated, or do they know?
I don't know. He said he had one track 5 miles in 24 hours, and I was like, "Why would a fish move that much?" And he said, well, think about it. They've got nothing else to do but swim.
Sometimes we overcomplicate things.
It's like he's got nothing else to do but swim.
That's right. But I'm curious to know what a school of shad, how much do they move? What does fishing pressure push them around? How much of that was kind of put on them by boats going over top of them or whatever? Who knows?
Well, another really cool thing that I've learned with live sonar can be a very big key when it comes to crappie fishing, at least in the South, is years ago we would really look for areas that were holding a lot of shad. You would say, all right, here's the bait fish, the crappie are here. And now, the more that I've used live sonar over the last couple of years, is I still look for the areas of shad, but I want the outside edges of them. I don't want the middle of the shad balls or the big area that's holding the shad. I want to really concentrate on the outside edges more.
Like fish that are looking for the shad and haven't found them yet?
Well, no, they're found them.
They found them.
It's kind of like us. Would you much rather be resting in an area that's not crowded and not chaotic? Well, these fish, in my mind, and sometimes it's even like a herding thing. I think they stay on the outside edges to keep them in an area herded up. But now if I go to an area and it's absolutely loaded with shad, I get up and leave. I don't even fish that any longer.
I learned that in Alabama fishing for bass. Like if you get into like a December, January time frame where those shad are piled into the back of creeks, it's like, oh man, this is mother lode.
Oh yeah.
I couldn't catch a fish in there.
Nope. It's too much going on.
That's right.
Well, with live sonar, you're like, all right, I can identify a crappie on my screen and say, all right, I know this is a crappie. And to get a bait to them, you're like, there's 600 on the screen. Why would he choose this little bait? It's almost like it's too much competition. Yeah.
Well, what's the old proverbial, if a white-tailed deer walks out into a field and he's got 2 bales of hay, which one is he going to pick? He might starve trying to decide. We know that's not true, but really it does come down to their ability to make decisions. Yeah. So, well, let's shift into the last topic here I want to talk about, and that is kind of your inspiration. What gets you out of bed in the morning, and how do you, as a guide, I'll be honest, Brad, like I would burn out being a guide. I just I don't do well with that kind of thing for long term. But you've done it for a long time. Yeah. And the last couple times we fished together, you're patient, you're kind, you're eager to go. You're like, I don't feel rushed if I don't have my poop in a group when we get to the boat ramp. What is it that keeps you going?
You know me, it's when I know I'm blessed, and then I know that people are relying on me to have a good time, and the catching part is the plus. But also, I've got to realize, and I did in the beginning, because just the competitive side of me, I want to catch as many as we can and just blow their mind away every day. But I want people to have a good time. I want them to learn a little bit something, and just enjoy the time on the water, because that's really what it's about to me, is enjoying the time on the water. But also, it's meeting new people and getting to see my old buddies that's fished with me for years, and just keep being growing the sport and letting people, especially it's so chaotic nowadays, everybody is in a rush to do everything else in life. And when you get on your boat, you shouldn't have to be that kind of rush deal. Have a good time and really relax and learn, and just pay attention to the details, and you'll become successful. And you just, every day I just put my all into it, and some days it works, some days I don't.
You seem to enjoy teaching too.
I do. I love it. And that's my favorite guide trips to do. When somebody says, hey man, I don't care if we catch a fish today, let's just go out there and you pick out a new part of the lake and go try to find them. And that's kind of my favorite thing to do, is teach people about crappie fishing, and I'm very lucky to do that.
Well, you're absolutely right. There's it's a blessed life we lead, and and there's no doubt there's a job behind everything that we have to do. And Dave, for example, he goes home, he goes fishing. There's a collective passion that we have, that if you're going to go and recover from whatever it is you're doing, it's that time on the water. You know what an eel pout is? You need to come visit us.
Okay.
You really do. There's a thing that he does. I've never caught one, but man, it is a cult following in Minnesota. You want to say something about this?
I don't even know what to say.
we're gonna, at one point, we're gonna do an eel pout show on this thing, just to talk about.
Well, every day for me is a challenge. I mean, weather conditions, and there's so many variables that you can't control, but you can control just never giving up once you hit the water, and just keep going after it, and taking the good with the bad some days.
Well, when we got out of bed this morning, I kind of was wondering, like, man, the wind is going to blow. It's going to be sketchy. We traded texts. Is this going to be worth it? And you're like, yeah, I think it might be, but you never know. They're crappies, and we kicked out a great segment. I'm excited about it. You'll see this on a 2025 season of In-Fisherman TV. One of the things I'm really looking forward to sharing with people is the legacy of In-Fisherman. With 2025 being the 50th anniversary, we're going to dig back into the archives of In-Fisherman TV, some of the old videos decades ago.
Wow.
And it'd be interesting to see some of the crappie techniques that were employed 20, 30 years ago, and how they've changed. Something that I found in the office was 350 cassette tapes of old In-Fisherman radio parts. And they're little what, Dave, do you remember? They're like 3-4 minute pieces.
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, syndicated out across the country. Pretty impressive what they did. And I found an old tape deck in our old studio. I blew the dust off, plugged it in, dropped the tape in, and about that time Doug walked in. And I pushed play, and it was Dave Sanda, which is a name from the days of old. He lives in Florida, I believe now, talking about a tube jig in 1987. And I think we listened to about 30 seconds of that, and I pushed stop, and Doug was like, man, that tube, it still catches them. And he went on for about 10 minutes about the viability of some of the old school techniques that still play today.
Yeah.
And I think that while technology advances, as tactics and techniques grow and anglers become better, there's still a foundation I think that we have to have. We need to know how to find fish. We need to know how to catch fish in a situation that we're not able to look at a screen and just go, oh, well, that was easy. It doesn't work like that necessarily. And as far as the technology is concerned, you know what? The very best of technology are going to be the very best without it.
Yeah.
The anglers that can figure out how to implement that into their day-to-day are going to be the best. And I think it's super important that as anglers that we talk about teaching our kids, teaching the next generation that time on the water is king, and sharing that with grandkids is king. And by the way, you're getting in the business of being a granddaddy out here. Excited for you on that.
Absolutely.
I'm not too far behind you, but not yet. Thank God. But, I think what I want with this podcast and what we've got coming up in 2025 is to share the legacy of selective harvest, of catch and release, of northern cats driving south to fish with a southern guy and learning your way of doing it. And by golly, Dave, we ought to try this up at home. I gotta believe we could catch fish there like that.
Yeah, try the techniques up north.
But that's it. And then we have a good story to tell.
Yeah.
And taking people out and showing them, hey, you know where I learned this? I learned this in Mississippi.
That's right.
The river? No, the state. We have a state called Mississippi. It starts with an M. Totally different. But hey, I want to thank you for sitting down with us. This is fun. I think that we're probably going to do this again sometime, because as time changes and seasons change and bites just different from yesterday till tomorrow, there's always a good story to tell. And when you sit down and dig into this stuff, it gets to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I love it.
Well, talk to me about your podcast quick. Where can people find it? It's all about crappies.
Yeah, all about crappie, the crappie connection, and kind of little storyline. But we're on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook.
You guys do the video thing, right?
We video. Also, I do a live stream every Tuesday night, and it's called Today's Bite, where me and my co-host Dustin McDaniel from Grand Lake, Oklahoma, we do live reports from really all across the country with different guests as well of actually working at that particular time frame. And that's every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. It's really fun. I love crappie fishing. It drives me every day. Well, it shows, and I want to encourage anybody that's looking for a fantastic time. Come to Mississippi. Look up Brad Chappell. Brad Chappell Guide Service. That simple. It's pretty easy to find. You're on social media? Everywhere. You have a website? Have a website, social media, Brad Chappell Guide Service. That's pretty easy. Dave, there's one thing I need from you. What would Ole and Lena have to say about all this? Well, Ole and Lars, they love crappies. They wanted to come down to Mississippi and get in on it. They drove their boats, each one of them, came down. They weren't dialed in like you were, Brad, but working both ends of the lake. Lars comes driving over to Ole and says, Ole, have you had any luck? And Ole looks at Lars. He says, well, I sure have, Lars. And he said, if you can guess how many crappies I have in my live well, you can have both of them. Whenever I can have Mr. Dave Penning on this show, we are going to do that and be prepared to go on a journey that goes nowhere. That's right. Absolutely. Hey, Brad, thank you for being here. Dave Penning, our producer. It's been a lot of fun the last couple of days. We're going to go out again tomorrow, see what happens. You'll have to pay attention on In-Fisherman TV 2025 to see what we did. This is In-Fisherman Storyline. I'm Thomas Allen. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and we will catch you here next time.